Patricia Langford strode through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport like a monarch surveying her kingdom. Her heels clicked against the polished tiles with a rhythm that demanded attention, each step a declaration of her presence. Her platinum blonde hair, swept into an impeccable chignon, gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her designer carry-on, a sleek, leather-bound testament to her status, glided effortlessly behind her. She didn't just walk. She commanded the space, her sharp hazel eyes slicing through the crowd with a mix of disdain and disinterest. To Patricia, these people, the harried families, the disheveled businessmen, the overworked staff, were mere background noise, insignificant players in the grand theater of her life. She was a titan in her world, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of the hospitality industry with a chain of luxury hotels stretching from coast to coast. At 52, Patricia had cultivated an image of unassailable success, poised, polished, and perpetually in control. Her name carried weight whispered in boardrooms, printed in glossy magazines, etched into the gold-plated plaques of her properties. She didn't just live well. She lived above, and she made sure everyone knew it. Today was no different. The flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C., was a ritual she perfected over decades, a seamless performance of privilege. First class wasn't just a ticket to her, it was a birthright. She relished the predictability of it all. The priority boarding that parted the sea of economy passengers. The crisp clink of a champagne flute placed in her hand before takeoff. The hushed murmur of conversations between people who mattered. This was her domain, a sanctuary of exclusivity where the chaos of the world below couldn't touch her dot as she approached the gate. Her lips curled into a faint, self-assured smile. She handed her boarding pass to the attendant, a young woman, with a nervous grin, who fumbled slightly under Patricia's gaze and stepped onto the jet bridge. The air smelled of leather and recycled luxury, a scent she'd come to associate with victory. She was in her element, untouchable, a queen ascending her throne. But even queens have their blind spots. As she passed a baggage handler struggling with an overstuffed suitcase, Patricia's eyes narrowed. He was a stocky man, his dark skin glistening with sweat under the weight of his labor. Typical, she thought, her mind flicking to a well-worn stereotype she'd never bothered to question. Always so slow. She didn't linger on it. Why would she? It was just a passing observation, a quiet confirmation of the order she believed in. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and kept moving, her thoughts already drifting to the meeting awaiting her in D.C., where she'd charm a room full of investors with the same effortless grace she brought to everything else. The jet bridge stretched ahead, a tunnel to her next triumph. Patricia didn't look back. She never did. After all, what was there to see? The world behind her was beneath her notice, and the world ahead was hers to command. Or so, she thought. Patricia Langford stepped into the first-class cabin with the air of a seasoned performer taking the stage. The plush seats, the soft hum of the engines warming up, the faint scent of lavender from the complimentary amenity kits. It was all as it should be, a world tailored to her exacting standards. She smoothed the front of her tailored blazer and scanned the rows, her eyes narrowing slightly as she located her seat. Awaited her seat. Zeroing slightly as she located her seat. Window side, her preferred perch for gazing down at the earth she'd conquered. But as she approached, her stride faltered, her polished veneer cracking just enough to let a flicker of irritation slip through. There, into B, sat a man she hadn't expected. He was black, dressed in a crisp navy suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his frame, his posture relaxed yet commanding. A laptop rested on the tray table in front of him, its screen casting a cool glow across his face as his fingers moved with quiet precision over the keys. He didn't look up as she neared, didn't acknowledge her presence with so much as a glance. To Patricia, that was the first offense. She was used to being noticed, her arrival a subtle event in itself. But this man, this stranger, seemed oblivious, absorbed in whatever he was doing as if he belonged here more than she did. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She set her designer tote down with a deliberate thud, the sound sharp enough to cut through the cabin's muted chatter. Still, he didn't flinch. She slid into her seat, her movements stiff, her mind already spinning. Who was he? How had he gotten here? First class wasn't for just anyone. It was a privilege earned, a status symbol she'd spent decades cultivating. She stole a glance at him. His suit was expensive, his demeanor polished, but that only deepened her unease. He didn't fit the picture she'd painted of this space, a picture she'd guarded fiercely in her mind. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. She could sip her champagne, bury herself in the latest issue of Forbes, and pretend he wasn't there. But the thought gnawed at her, a splinter under her perfectly manicured nails. She shifted in her seat, her purse brushing against his armrest, an accident, or so she'd claim. No reaction. He kept typing, his focus unbroken, the glow of the screen highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. Patricia's chest tightened. This wasn't right. She'd flown this road 100 times, and never, not once, had she been forced to sit next to someone who made her feel out of place. She straightened, smoothing her scarf as if it could restore her composure. Then, with a practiced flick of her wrist, she pressed the call button. A soft chime rang overhead, and within moments, a flight attendant appeared. Emily Jacobs, according to the name tag pinned to her Navy uniform. She was young, early 30s perhaps, with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Emily said, her tone warm but measured. "How can I assist you?" Patricia tilted her head, her voice dripping with a politeness she didn't feel. "Excuse me, I think there's been a mix-up. Could you check if this gentleman is in the right seat?" She gestured toward the man beside her, Daniel Stokes. Though she didn't know his name yet, her fingers hovering just long enough to make her point. Emily blinked, then glanced at Daniel, who still hadn't looked up. "Of course, ma'am. One moment." She pulled a tablet from her apron, tapping the screen with quick, efficient strokes. Patricia watched, her pulse ticking upward, certain this would be resolved swiftly. A mistake had been made, and Emily would fix it. That was how it worked. "Actually," Emily said after a beat, her smile tightening, "Mr. Stokes is in his assigned seat, 2B. Your ticket is for 2SO. Everything checks out." She looked up, expectant, as if that settled the matter. Patricia's fingers tightened around the edge of her armrest. "That's odd," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to her own ears. "Are you sure?" "I just assumed." She let the sentence hang, her eyes darting to Daniel, then back to Emily, willing the younger woman to pick up on the unspoken implication. Emily's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "I'm sure, ma'am. The manifest is correct." She paused, then added, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Patricia's face twitched, a crack in her carefully curated mask. "No, that's all," she said, her voice clipped. Emily nodded and stepped away, leaving Patricia stewing in her seat. She turned toward the window, her breath shallow, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm against her knee. This wasn't over. She wasn't the kind of woman to let things slide, not when they challenged her sense of order, her sense of right. Beside her, Daniel sighed a subtle, almost imperceptible sound and kept working. The glow from his laptop seemed to mock her, a silent reminder of his indifference. She couldn't stand it. He wasn't reacting, wasn't explaining himself, wasn't playing the part she'd cast him in. That made her angrier. She wasn't just anyone. She was Patricia Langford, and she didn't sit quietly when something or someone disrupted her world. She pressed the call button again, harder. This time, the chime cutting through the cabin like a demand. Emily returned, her smile still in place but her steps slower, as if she sensed the storm brewing. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her tone a touch firmer. Patricia leaned forward, her voice low but laced with steel. "I'd like to request a seat change." She paused, letting the words settle, then tilted her head slightly toward Daniel. "I don't feel comfortable sitting here," Emily's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. Is there an issue with the seat itself?" "No, it's not the seat," Patricia cut in, her patience thinning. "I just prefer to sit elsewhere." She kept her eyes on Emily, her words slow and deliberate, trusting the flight attendant would read between the lines. Emily glanced at Daniel, who had paused his typing but still said nothing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his jaw tight, as if he were waiting for something. "Let me check if there are any open seats," Emily said, tapping her tablet again. "Just a moment." Patricia sat back, her lips pressed into a firm line. She could feel the eyes of other passengers now, a man in a blazer a few rows ahead, pretending to scroll his phone. A woman across the aisle, nudging her husband. They were watching, and that only fueled her resolve. She wasn't wrong. She couldn't be. Emily's fingers stilled. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity in first class today, ma'am. There are no open seats available." Patricia's stomach clenched. "What about economy?" she asked, her voice catching slightly. "Surely there's something there." Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking to Daniel and back. "There are 2 open seats in economy, yes. Would you like me to arrange?" "Perfect," Patricia interrupted, sitting straighter. "He can take one of them." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Daniel inhaled deeply, his fingers drumming once on his laptop before going still. Emily blinked, as if replaying the words in her mind. "Ma'am," she said, her voice lower now, firmer. "Just to clarify, you want me to move this passenger to economy because you don't want to sit next to him?" Patricia nodded once, her chin lifting. "Yes." Emily inhaled through her nose, her hands folding in front of her. "That won't be happening. Mr. Stokes has a first-class ticket, just like you. He's in his assigned seat. I cannot and will not ask him to move." Patricia's face flushed, heat creeping up her neck. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice rising. "I'm simply asking for the same courtesy anyone else would get if they felt uncomfortable." Emily didn't budge. "You're asking me to remove a paying passenger from his assigned seat and relocate him to economy for no valid reason. That's not an accommodation. That's discrimination." A sharp silence fell. Someone let out a low whistle. Patricia's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a leather case, flipped it open, and held it up with a calmness that chilled her to the bone. A gold FBI badge gleamed under the cabin lights, its emblem unmistakable. The air shifted. Passengers gasped. A few chuckled. Daniel's voice was smooth, unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, tilting his head, "would you like to file an official complaint?" "I can take your statement right now." Patricia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her world tilted, and for the first time, she felt the weight of every eye in the cabin bearing down on her. The cabin seemed to shrink around Patricia Langford as the glint of Daniel Stokes' FBI badge burned into her vision. Her breath hitched, a strangled sound caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The murmurs that had rippled through the seats moments ago erupted into a quiet cacophony, soft gasps, stifled laughter, the rustle of bodies shifting to get a better view. Her hands, once steady with the confidence of a woman who bent the world to her will, trembled faintly against the armrest. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't tear her eyes away from the badge that had turned her carefully orchestrated performance into a public unraveling. Daniel's voice cut through the haze, smooth and deliberate, each word a dagger. She couldn't dodge. "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am?" He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that wasn't anger, wasn't mockery, just a calm, unyielding certainty. "I can take your statement right now." Her mouth went dry. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt like sandpaper. File a complaint? Against an FBI agent? The absurdity of it crashed over her, followed by a wave of humiliation so sharp it made her chest ache. She'd meant to dismiss him, to erase him from her space with a few well-placed words. But now he held the power, and he wielded it with a stillness that made her feel small, exposed, wrong. The cabin lights seemed too bright, the air too thick, and every pair of eyes drilling into her amplified the heat creeping up her neck. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a Bluetooth earpiece smirked, muttering, "Oh, this is rich," loud enough for her to hear. A young woman 3 rows back, barely 20, with a phone clutched in her hand, grinned as her thumbs flew across the screen. The faint click of her typing a death knell Patricia didn't yet fully grasp. Emily, the flight attendant, stood nearby, arms crossed, her professional smile replaced by a neutral mask that somehow felt like judgment. Even the passengers who hadn't spoken watched her now, their silence louder than words. Patricia forced her lips to move. I. She stammered, her voice a faint croak, barely audible over the hum of the engines. She shook her head, a tiny, jerky motion, as if she could shake off the moment itself. No complaint. Daniel nodded once, a gesture so measured it might have been rehearsed. Without another word, he closed the leather case, slipped it back into his jacket, and flipped open his laptop. His fingers resumed their steady rhythm on the keys, the soft tap-tap-tap, a metronome to her spiraling panic. Just like that, he was done, with her back to his world, untouched by the chaos she'd unleashed. For him, this was nothing. For her, it was everything. Emily stepped closer, her voice low but firm, cutting through the fog in Patricia's mind. "Ma'am, I need to confirm that you're okay to remain on this flight without further disruption." Her eyes lingered, searching Patricia's face for something compliance, perhaps, or a sign she wouldn't push this any further. Patricia stiffened, her pride clawing its way back to the surface. Disruption? She wasn't the problem here. She was the victim, wasn't she? She'd only asked for what she deserved, for the comfort she'd paid for. But Daniel's badge had flipped the script, and now she was the one on trial. She forced a thin smile, her teeth gritted behind it. "I'm fine," she said, the words tasting like ash. Emily's gaze held hers for a beat longer. Then she nodded. "I'm going to hold you to that." She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the cabin's ambient noise. Patricia exhaled shakily, her hands clenching together in her lap. It was over. She'd survived. She could still salvage this, couldn't she? Then her phone buzzed. Once, twice, a third time. The sound jolted her, a sharp reminder that the world wasn't confined to this cabin. She fumbled for her purse, her fingers clumsy as they dug inside and wrapped around the device. The screen lit up with notifications, texts, emails, alerts, and her stomach dropped. A message from her assistant. "Patricia, what's going on? People are texting me about a video." Another from a board member. "Is this you? Call me now." Third, from an old college friend she hadn't spoken to in years. "Pat, tell me this isn't real." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She swiped to unlock the phone, her thumb trembling as she opened Twitter. It took less than a second for her name to appear, trending alongside a hashtag #first-class fiasco. She tapped it, and there it was, a video uploaded just minutes ago by the girl 3 rows back. The title screamed in bold letters, "Racist businesswoman tries to boot black man from first class, turns out he's FBI." The view count ticked upward as she stared. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Comments poured. And below it, karma in real time. She thought she'd get away with it. Who was this lady? Expose her. Patricia's vision blurred. The phone slipped in her sweaty grip, but she couldn't look away. The cabin spun around her, the laughter and whispers blending into a roar in her ears. She'd lost control, not just of the moment, but of everything. And it was only the beginning. Patricia Langford clutched her phone as if it were a lifeline, her knuckles whitening against the sleek case. The cabin noise, the hum of the engines, the clink of glassware, the muted chatter faded into a dull roar, drowned out by the pounding of her pulse. She barely registered the pilot's voice over the intercom, announcing their descent into Washington, D.C. Her eyes were glued to the screen, the video's view count climbing with ruthless speed. 50,000, 70,000, 97,000. Each tick felt like a hammer strike to her chest, shattering the world she'd spent decades building. Her name, Patricia Langford, was trending now. A hashtag branded across the internet like a scarlet letter. Hashtag racist in first class. The comments scrolled endlessly. A tidal wave of outrage and mockery she couldn't stop. Entitled much? One read. The FBI reveal is chef's kiss, another taunted. Hope she enjoys the internet dragging her. She deserves it. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing for a way out. Maybe it would blow over. Maybe no one important would see it. Maybe she could spin this, call it a misunderstanding. But then her phone buzzed again, a text from her sister. Pat, what the hell did you do? She declined the call with a shaky finger, her stomach twisting into knots. She wasn't ready to face that knot yet. The plane touched down with a jolt, and Patricia was the first to unbuckle her seatbelt, her movements frantic. She needed to escape, to get off this plane, out of this spotlight, away from the eyes that had witnessed her fall. She grabbed her tote and bolted down the aisle, ignoring the side glances, the quiet chuckles, the weight of judgment pressing against her back. Daniel Stokes stayed seated, his laptop still open, his expression as unreadable as ever. He didn't spare her a glance. Why would he? To him, she was a blip, a fleeting annoyance in an otherwise ordinary day. She burst into Reagan National Airport, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, her scarf slipping loose in her haste. But as she neared baggage claim, her heart stopped. A cluster of reporters, not a mob, not yet, but enough to make her skin crawl, stood waiting. A woman in a navy blazer held a microphone, her voice crisp as she read from her phone. The now viral video shows an unidentified woman attempting to have an FBI agent removed from first class, citing discomfort. The clip has gained over 1 million views in just hours. Patricia's breath caught. 1 million. The number echoed in her skull, impossible and undeniable. The reporter's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Patricia's. Wait, that's her! She shouted, and the cameraman swung his lens toward her. Panic spiked in her chest. She spun on her heel, her tote banging against her hip as she darted toward the exit. Miss Langford! A voice called behind her. Do you have a response? To the video? She didn't stop, didn't look back. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, texts, calls, alerts, a symphony of her undoing. She shoved past a group of travelers, her breath ragged, her hands clammy, and flung herself into the first taxi she saw. Go, she snapped at the driver. Now, the man raised an eyebrow but pulled away from the curb without a word. Patricia pressed her hands to her temples, her eyes squeezed shut, as if she could block out the chaos. 1 million views. Her name exposed, her stomach churned. She'd built her life on reputation board meetings where her word was law, gala dinners, where she was toasted as a visionary, a legacy etched in marble and gold. In a single afternoon, it was gone, reduced to a punchline on a stranger's screen. Her phone vibrated again, a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it, her heart hammering, then swiped to answer just before it went to voicemail. "Hello?" she croaked. A brief silence, then a clipped voice. "Miss Langford, this is James Rollins, chair of the Marston Foundation. I assume you're aware of the situation." Her mouth went dry. The Marston Foundation, a charity she'd served on for years, a beacon of progressive values she'd leveraged to polish her image. She knew what was coming. "James, we're gonna need you to step down," he interrupted, his tone flat and final. Immediately, her pulse roared in her ears. "This is being taken out of context. The board disagrees. We'll issue a statement by morning. We expect your resignation by then." A sharp beep, he'd hung up. Patricia lowered the phone slowly, her hands trembling. Her career, her status, her carefully curated life, it was over. No one cared about her side. The video was enough. She let out a shaky breath, staring blankly at the taxi's worn upholstery. Meanwhile, Daniel Stokes had likely stepped off the plane without a second thought, heading to a meeting or a mission, his life untouched. For him, this was Tuesday. For Patricia, it was the end. But the true reckoning lay in the ashes of her choices. She'd wielded her privilege like a weapon, expecting the world to bend, only to find it would break her instead. Racism wasn't just a misstep, it was a choice, and Patricia had made hers. Now, she'd live with the consequences, a cautionary tale etched not in gold. But in the unforgiving glow of a million screens, Patricia Langford's taxi disappeared into the DC night, swallowed by the shadows of a city that no longer welcomed her. Her phone, now silent in her lap, bore the scars of her undoing 2 million views. A trending hashtag, a name once synonymous with triumph, now reduced to a cautionary tale. She'd built her life on the belief that privilege was her shield, that her status could bend reality to her whims. But in the glare of Daniel Stokes' FBI badge, that shield shattered, exposing the rot beneath. A racism so ingrained she'd wielded it without a second thought, expecting the world to nod in agreement. Daniel, meanwhile, stepped into the evening unbothered, his badge tucked away, his focus already on the next mission. He didn't need to fight her battle. He'd won it by simply existing, by refusing to shrink under her gaze. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, a quiet rebuke to a woman who saw his skin before his humanity. Where Patricia demanded the world conform to her prejudices, Daniel navigated it with a dignity she couldn't fathom. A dignity that turned her arrogance into ash. This story isn't just about one flight, one badge, one viral video. It's a mirror held up to a society where privilege too often blinds, where biases fester unchecked until they spill into the open, raw, and ugly. Patricia's fall isn't a fluke, it's a reckoning. A reminder that racism isn't a passive relic, but an active choice with a price. She paid dearly, not because she was caught, but because she dared to act on a belief the world no longer tolerates. And in her ruin lies a lesson etched in stark relief. No one stands above accountability. Not even a queen who forgets the crown she wears is borrowed.